Добрый день. Меня зовут Джон Lloyd. Очень рад быть здесь. Здесь тоже Марк Левинсон, там, Дэвид Рид и Катлин Грэм. Я буду говорить по-английски, потому что я знаю, что вы все говорите очень хорошо по-английски. Но если нет, если что-то не ясно, вам надо мне сказать. Окей. Mark, David, especially Mark, I think, will speak quite a lot to you about theory of macroeconomics, which is important for your work. I will touch on that, but I wanted to try to make it concrete for you, for the kind of stories that you will do or are doing. You must tell me what stories you're doing, and you must ask me questions, come back to me. I'll be asking you questions in the course of this morning and in the next seminar, because I want it to be as interactive as possible. I don't know what you know. I don't know how good your English is, but one of the fundamental things in journalism is that the only bad question is the one you don't ask. So even if you think it's a silly question, a naive question, a question that other people will know the answer to, ask it. Because if things are not clear to you here, they may not be clear to you when you have to do a story. And most of you, like most of us, journalists, have to work under a lot of pressure. Especially those of you who work for the website and for television, but also for newspapers and even magazines where you've got a longer time to think about things and understand things and research things. We always work under a lot of pressure, which means that the more things we know before, the more we can rely on as a kind of foundation for what we do in journalism. The first question. Is it too loud? Okay, is that better? Can you hear me? Nope. How's that? All right? Okay. All of you are, to some extent, experienced journalists. You'll tell me how experienced. But you will always, not but, and you will know that journalism is complex. Nearly everything we do in every stage of journalism, with very, very few exceptions, is complex. Because the things we describe, the events which take place in society, in politics, in economics, finance, business, which we're discussing here today, are complicated. Part of your job, much of your job, is to make the complicated things more simple, so that people who are not specialists will understand them, and will know, at least in part, the important things about economics, business, and finance. So journalism is complex. Some journalism is more complex than others. Politics, which is difficult to separate from economics, and we'll discuss why, is complicated. But in most countries, it becomes less complicated because it's represented. People write about it, broadcast about it, in ways which make it more simple. And the way of making politics more simple is to make it into a kind of football game. Who wins, who loses, which party wins, which individual wins, which party, which individual loses. So it becomes, as I say, a bit like sport reporting. And journalistic descriptions of politics almost everywhere make politics into a competition. It's one way of understanding it, because politics is in part a competition, at least in democratic states where there are different parties and different individuals trying to get public office. So my first question to you is not an economic one, but a political one. How much do you think, in your experience, how much journalism in Ukraine about politics is about competition. Competition between individuals, competition between parties. How much? And how well, then, does that describe Ukrainian politics? So the principle of competition still works, but it's in part a corporate, a competition between corporations, between oligarchs or different groups, which stand behind the politics. So the political journalism is about, in part at least, economics and finance and business. Okay, that's true everywhere, by the way. Business, as I said, business, economics, finance, and politics can't be easily separated. But what you're saying here is, in some ways, it's more clear, it's more obvious than in other places. Okay, anybody else want to come in on that? Okay. So, since politics is competition, democratic politics is competition, competition between parties, between individuals, then describing politics as a matter of competition, competition which takes place within parties as well as between them, competition for power within political parties, which happens everywhere and is often very tough and very sharp, you can, as a journalist, get away with. You can describe politics in that way, and in part you're describing reality. It's more difficult, I think, in the sphere of finance, economics, and business. Not because there is no competition, as Ivan was saying, there is competition and it becomes political quite quickly, but because the issues in finance and economics and business are inevitably more complicated more quickly. To understand what's happening, say in a merger between two companies, or in the reasons for workers going on strike, or in when we're dealing with more with macroeconomics, in the reasons why countries might default on their debt, and we'll talk about defaulting on the debt later on. These have to be explained very quickly, otherwise nobody knows what you're talking about, or what you're broadcasting about. So you, as business and economic journalists, have got in some ways a harder job than your colleagues who are discussing politics or social events. You've got a harder job because you have to understand, and understand more quickly, what is happening in complicated events. We're discussing today macroeconomics. Anybody want to give a definition of what macroeconomics is? Nobody know what macroeconomics is?
It's indicators within the country.
Mm.
The key indicators that unemployment level, GDP rate, inflation, and so on.
Exactly. Well, you're exactly right for the indicators. These are some of the main indicators. Sorry, go on. Yes, that too. Macro, the word macro is a Greek word for big. So it's big economics. Okay? And usually macro and microeconomics are compared. Micro means small. So macroeconomics, as Taras was saying, tends to deal with economic issues at the national level, or sometimes at the regional level, but very often at the national level. And some of the indicators are the ones which he has indicated: GDP, gross domestic product, unemployment rates, inflation rates, so on. The kind of indicators which show or point towards the health of the economy, how well the economy is doing, or how badly the economy is doing. These indicators are quite difficult to interpret very often. Sometimes things which seem very bad, like a rise in unemployment, which is bad for those who are unemployed, can mean that the economy is shifting into a different kind of production and ultimately will be better for it. That happened in my country, in the UK, in the 90s. And it happens in some way in most economies at some point. But these indicators are important for journalists to understand, to know what they are. They are the kind of the basics of your trade when you're dealing with macroeconomics. And so you have to know about them, you have to understand what they're doing, and see how they're moving, because they move continually. So macroeconomics is the field within which you will work, and probably already are working, where you have to describe what's happening to your country very often. So I want to talk this morning a bit about a case, a macroeconomic case, which is a very macro story indeed, and it's one which will touch on what you're doing, what you're writing about and broadcasting about, something which is important for Ukraine. And in the second session, I'll go more deeply into why it's so important for Ukraine. And that is the economic crisis in the European Union. Certainly within that part of the European Union, the 17 countries of the European Union, which has got 26 members, the 17 countries which are members of the euro currency, and within the euro area itself, the EU itself, and indeed within the world, because Europe is a very large economic fact within the world, and how the European Union does is a very large economic fact in the world, in the same way as at the moment it is a very large economic fact whether or not the United States defaults on its debt. We'll talk about that later on as well. So, getting back to Europe, who wants to tell me about what the crisis in the European Union is, or the euro area is? What does the crisis consist of? Why is it a crisis?
Because the level of state debt to GDP is quite high.
Yeah.
Different countries such as Greece, Italy, Portugal, and some considered to be key players in this crisis process.
Right.
Though Greece is considered to be the central country, the problem as their debt has been receiving huge amounts of international help from the international creditors such as IMF, Euro Commission, and World Bank. And so the weather on the Greek economic market, it pretty much defines the economic outcasts for whole European region.
The economic outcomes. Yeah. Greece defines the economic outcomes, you mean? Or the crisis in Greece? Yeah, I wouldn't go quite that far. I mean, Greece is a relatively small economy. I mean, relative clearly to the world, but even relative to the European Union. It has become extremely important, though, as you say, because it has been the crisis there is most severe. And the gap between, you might call the Greek national income and the Greek debt is very large. It's actually not as large as in some other countries, but because the level of trust in Greek banks, in the Greek government and so on was so low, and has got lower, and because Greece needed so much assistance from the European Union and from the IMF and elsewhere, then it has become the fever ward, the most obvious sign of the crisis. And it's also where much of the journalism has been done. One of the reasons why journalism has been done, as you who are broadcast correspondents will well understand, is because it's more dramatic. The Greeks are more dramatic. Naturally, since that's where drama began, but also because they get out on the streets and protest vigorously about what is happening to their economy and to what exactly. What are they protesting about, the Greeks? Right. Not an unusual human response, but yes, they are objecting to cuts in social programs, cuts in pensions, cuts in salaries, cuts everywhere. But what's this known as? What's the word that sums this up? The English word? Austerity. Austerity means, well, you know what it means. It means cuts, actually. It means that if you have an austere program, it means that it's reduced. In the case of Greece, it means you don't spend more than you earn, and Greece has been spending a great deal more than it's earned for many years, and incidentally tending to not be wholly truthful about how the finances have gone. So in a way, the past has caught up with Greece. Its own past has caught up with Greece, and it's now in big trouble, as Ivan was saying. Is Portugal, is Spain, is Italy, less obviously so, and Ireland. Although now I don't know if you've seen this in the news, but Ireland, which is also a very small economy, only about smaller than Greece, about 3.5 million people, in the Irish Republic, which is within the British Isles, but is, as you know, in an independent state. It also was very, very badly hit by the crisis, but had a big dose of austerity, lots of cuts. The government which put these cuts into operation was voted against, and a new government came in. But now Ireland is beginning to exit from the austerity program that it had to observe, and will be out, it hopes, by December. The same is not true of Greece, nor of Portugal, nor of Spain. Have any of you followed the events enough to know what the problems were in some of these countries? There were different problems in different countries. It wasn't just one size fits all. What was the problem, say, in Spain or in Ireland? Yes. Much more than 20%. 40%. Jobs, yeah. Any other reasons for? That's true. That's what's happened in Spain. Youth unemployment is very, very high. At one point, it was said to be approaching almost half, 50%, but it's certainly around 40% or more. Any other reasons why?
They had problems with the banking sector, as the banks invested money in infrastructure projects, in construction, and it didn't work out well. So government had to intervene the banking sector and put some money in, and
That's right. Intervene in the banking sector and put a lot of money into it. All governments, in one way or the other, had to do that. Indeed, the Irish government put huge amounts. Actually, so did the British government. Britain is not in the euro area. It still retains the pound, but its banks were very, very badly hit indeed. Were in danger of going bust, especially the Royal Bank of Scotland, which was then the biggest bank in the world. Scotland, as you know, is part of Britain. It's the part that I come from. I'm Scottish. The Royal Bank of Scotland, which became very, very big indeed, was very much overextended and then collapsed. Had it not been saved by the government, it would have gone out of business. Yeah, well, it's a big question. Also, I think the Germans would reject your assertion that they haven't got no problems. They've actually got a big problem now about making a government, but it's true they got many fewer problems because they're much more successful economically, and because they're much more successful economically, they have become the big power within the European Union, and Chancellor Merkel is now the most powerful person within the European Union. She, especially since she was elected so convincingly, re-elected so convincingly a few weeks ago, is very powerful. Your question about, I think what you're asking is the European Union a good idea, or is the euro a good idea? That's what we're here for. Yeah, I don't want to stray too far from economics, Irina, but since you asked the question, I was going to talk about this later, but just very briefly. The European Union is, of course, political. Indeed, it was founded on one of the most important issues that politics can have, peace and war. As you know, in the late 30s and early 40s, the Second World War devastated large parts of Europe. And at the core of that war was where Germany, which was then under Nazi governance, and France. After the war, the politicians, many of whom had been in exile during the war, some of whom had been underground, came up with the idea, which had been developed by a number of them during the war, of having the European Union. And the European Union was explicitly designed in order to make peace, above all between France and Germany, because they had been at war many times in the past century, but also because the assumption was that if you have a European economic union, and at first it was called the European Economic Community before it became the European Union, then you will have peace. If countries are linked, closely linked, utterly interdependent economically, they will not go to war. That was the assumption, not a bad assumption, by the founding members, the people who first thought about the European Union and thought about it during the carnage and after the carnage of the Second World War. So, of course, it was political. It was designed to make peace, to keep peace between the warring countries of Europe, which had two world wars in the first part of the 20th century. So it was in that sense, it was a very good idea. What we're discussing now is 70 years after the first people began to think about the European Union, and more than 50 years after the European Economic Community was created with the Treaty of Rome. How far is that workable? And how far is it workable politically, of course, but also, and right now, most obviously, how far is it workable economically? What do I think about it? I'm not going to tell you. We'll think about it, we'll talk about it both now and later, and then perhaps at the end, I can ask you what you think about it. And it's, for reasons that I'll also talk about later, it's very important for Ukraine. Indeed, it's one of the most important issues facing Ukraine. Let me just go back to something I said earlier about complexity. One of the commentators, one of the best commentators on the European Union and upon the Euro and economics within the European Union, a man who was a colleague of mine at the Financial Times, called David Marsh, who wrote a very good book recently about Europe, has said, as rescue procedures for the Euro crisis, we now have a new set of rules and procedures which are difficult to understand. These ways in which the euro might be saved, the procedures are difficult to understand even for experts and for members of parliament, let alone ordinary citizens. So he's saying that the way in which the countries, the politicians, the experts within Europe have tried to deal with the big problems which Europe faces are almost incomprehensible to ordinary people and are difficult to understand for experts, for economists, people who've worked in this area for a long time, for parliamentarians, members of parliament who deal with it all the time, even probably for prime ministers. When I was in Brussels recently talking to people about this issue, a number of journalists said that they believed that most prime ministers signed things or agreed to things which they only partly understood. These are prime ministers, the heads of the governments of the countries. And when they were in meetings without their experts, without their advisors who did understand these things, very often they agreed to things which they didn't quite understand. So we're dealing with a very difficult, very complex, and at the same time, very important area. And what I discovered in Brussels, because the institute at which I work in Oxford, the Reuters Institute, is doing a project, is doing a piece of research into how coverage of Europe from the Brussels correspondence, how it's done, how good it is, how deep it is. So we talked to a large number of journalists, your colleagues, in Brussels, people who have been there for sometimes many years, covering the European Union, and asked them what they understood to be the problems of Europe. And many of them said that they found it very difficult to understand. Some of them had been trained in economics. Actually, most of them had not. And therefore, they found themselves struggling to understand and therefore describe the mechanisms which were put in place, exactly as David Marsh had written in his book. They were in the position of ordinary citizens, or ordinary citizens with a bit more knowledge. Or, as someone said about our trade, about journalism, we are not experts, but we're experts at finding experts. Or we should be experts at finding experts. After all, we need our sources. We need people not just to say what's happened, but to explain to us why they've happened and how they've happened and what kind of effects they will have when they do happen. So journalists in Europe, all of them or most of them coming from European countries, are now groping to understand what is in front of their eyes. And as you know, much of journalism is trying to understand what's in front of your eyes. You're seeing something, you're listening to something. What does it mean? It's not always very clear. Okay, so at the center of this issue is the euro. So tell me what you know about the euro. Who's going to tell me? Is it which? What did you say? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. No, not Europe, euro, the euro currency. Right. It's a currency. Anybody want to add to that? Undoubted truth. How much? Well, that's good. I'm glad you said that. And so when I change my euros for hryvnias, I'll know what to ask for. Is there, by the way, this is a purely disinterested question, is there a black market? Yeah. In currency, yeah. No.
Yes, it is, but it's not so big as it used to be in the 90s.
Right. You mean immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Ukraine, a lot of people, for example, even the big metro stations in Kyiv, for example, there is a special people, man, who just and they are changing money, the black market, a lot of money, and it
What is the black market rate now, do you think? Do you know?
it's only several coins lower than the currency exchange, but they are working on big volumes. So
Yeah.
if you need, for example, to change not 100 million euros, but 200,000, maybe something like this, there are special forums online. There are special people working around the exchange spots, and they are changing this money. It's not very big market, but
It exists.
it exists. Yes.
And they will give you a better rate than the banks.
Yes.
I have one more example of this black market. It's, for example, it's a very big, this market is the biggest market in Europe. It's 7 kilometers in Odessa, so it's very big market where people can buy everything. And there is some Vietnam people there, and they just walking around this market and try to and ask you, so we even call it some special name for these people going to the market, and they give better rates for
Yeah, yeah.
people. Yeah.
So,
Actually, it's one more interesting example. I just need several months ago to go to EU to change money, Ukraine's hryvnias to euros, and I just find online the currency exchange that I need very good, and make a call, and they said that they are working just a few meters from here. And when I go to this exchange spot, on the table one currency exchange low, but when I say, oh, I just call you from online, they say, oh, okay, they just give me this higher exchange,
all right.
non-officially.
Well, it's always good to ask, clearly. Okay, so the euro is a currency. It's the currency of those countries, 17 countries, which are in the euro area. So let's look at some of the component parts of money, because money, as you know, is at the root. People say it's the root of all evil, but it's certainly at the root of all economies. And actually, it's the root of whether you're talking about microeconomics at the level of the company or macroeconomics at the level of the country. Money tends to be what you're talking about quite soon. So, first and most obviously and most importantly, the euro is money. And money is a way of paying for things. It allows us to live. It's a means of exchange. We no longer really think about it very much because we have it. Usually we think we've got too little of it, but we need it to pay our rent, to buy things, to pay our debts, to buy whatever we want to buy, to get paid, whatever we're paid. We assume that the money that we get, usually very often in the form of paper, but when we get paid, something shifts from one bank account, our employer's bank account, into our bank account. Usually that's the way it now happens. But money is in paper, it's sometimes in coins, it's now increasingly in digits, in numbers that you see on your screens and that you see when you look at your bank account. But it also can be anything. Money has been things like shells, cowrie shells in some parts of the world, beads. It could be sheep or cows. Whatever the medium of exchange has been, it means that you're exchanging one value for another. Anything which has or is thought to have value. Some cultures thought that shells had a lot of value. They have no real value, or very little real value, but they were thought to have value, and therefore they did have value. In the same way as silver and gold is thought to have value, and thus does have value. And it's been, both gold and silver have been reliably stores of value for many centuries, and are continue to be so. However, countries shifted, bit by bit, away from a reliance on gold and silver, i.e. gold and silver backing their currencies, into paper currencies which are issued by governments, by the national bank, backed by the government, and therefore necessarily these currencies have to be trusted by the population, and the government has to be trusted at least insofar as it will back the currency and will not devalue the currency. Which of you knows how governments devalue currencies? Say, the government of Ukraine, for example. What could it do to your currency which would make it less valuable to you? Right. Why does printing so much money mean it's less valuable? Sorry? Right. So it no longer expresses the value of the economy. It becomes too much, it becomes therefore less valuable, and then what happens? Inflation happens. Right. So the prices go up again and again and again, and then when inflation becomes chronic, as it most famously in Europe did during Weimar Germany, then you get, as you did in Germany in the 1920s, you get the phenomenon of people pushing barrows full of notes, full of Deutschmarks in that case, to buy a bottle of milk or a loaf of bread, because everything cost huge amounts of money. At least the form was millions and billions of Deutschmarks to buy simple things. The same thing has happened in other countries in the world, and can happen when the currency goes completely out of control. So you need to have a currency which is stable in order to have a stable economy, and you therefore need to have trust in the government. Just to show you some notes. Notes now are the way in which most of our day-by-day transactions are done. So just to compare them a bit, to see how they're expressed, to see how governments want to keep trust in money. This is a British £5 note, okay? And it's issued by the Bank of England, which, although it's called the Bank of England, nevertheless issues money for all of Britain. Britain is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the Bank of England issues notes for all of these different regions of the UK. And on one side is, who's this? The Queen, our dear Queen. On the other side is another woman, whom I bet you don't know. I didn't know her either, actually, when I saw her, but I looked her up, because underneath there is Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Fry was famous in the late 18th, early 19th century. She was a Quaker, which is a religion, not very large religion, but an important one in the history, certainly, of Western Europe and North America. Best known for being pacifist and being very concerned with assisting people. And Elizabeth Fry, who came from a prominent family in the east of England, in Norwich, was a reformer, especially in prisons. She visited prisons in the early part of the 19th century. Prisons then were very bad places indeed. People died from disease and so on. And she began a process of reforming the prisons. She made people, politicians and others, think about the conditions in prisons. And that's what she's best known for. She was also a feminist, an early feminist, pushing for women's rights. But most of all, she's known for being a prison reformer. And on the top, underneath it says there, Bank of England, there's written in quite small type, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5. As you know, the British currency is pounds. So they're promising to pay on demand £5. £5 of what? Gold, yeah. However, if you take this into a bank and say, I want £5 of gold, please, you'll be out quite quickly without your gold, because £5 of gold would be thousands of pounds. But still, the idea that that a British pound, is backed by gold is still on the banknote. No longer true, hasn't been true for a long time, but it's still there. And we allow it to be there, allow that fiction to perpetuate itself, because that's just the way things are. And Britain changes very slowly, and has got lots of things which don't make much sense. This is a €5 note for the 17 countries which are in the euro, and it just says €5, and it says doesn't say much else actually. It says euro in Roman letters and in Greek letters, and it's got things which are quite difficult to know what they are. There's an arch there, which might be, I don't know what it is really, and there's more. I think you're probably right. Because one of the reasons why it doesn't exist is because if it did exist, people would say, well, why you got that thing from Germany and we're in Greece? Or why is that French thing here and we're in Sweden? No, Sweden doesn't. Does Sweden have the euro? No, Denmark. So the euro is a kind of, it's an everywhere currency, but a nowhere currency. Because the euro area, the area in which the euro circulates, isn't a state, it's an area, it's a currency. So you can't really have, or it's very difficult to have, something which says, this is what it is. It's not rooted in the way that the British currency is, rooted in the history of Britain, therefore Elizabeth Fry, and in the Queen, who's the head of state. Here's the 5 hryvnia note. Who's on that? Who? This is Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Sorry? Yeah, that's the one, exactly so. Bogdan Khmelnytsky is, on the other side is a church. I don't know which church it is, maybe you do. Okay. So this is dedicated to the memory of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, essentially, the €5 note. The €20 note hasn't got Bogdan on it, it's got somebody else. And other notes will have other people on it, in the same way as the British have different people on it. It always has the Queen. The Queen always gets to be on whatever note, but they've got different people on other notes. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, as you say, was influential in, if you like, taking Ukraine to the east and making its future much more a Russian future, or later on a Soviet future. Became much more Eastern, if you like, more orthodox than it had been before. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, together with the Zaporozhye Cossacks and the Crimean Tatars, went to war with the Poles, who were then in charge of at least the eastern part, the western part of Ukraine, and also, this is why Bogdan is not an uncontroversial figure in the world, and why people have objected to him being on the €5 hryvnia note. He was responsible for the killing of many, many Jews, thousands and thousands of Jews in the western part of Ukraine, who were seen by him and by others as being too linked with the Poles. So if you read accounts of Bogdan's adventures, you will see that this figures very highly, that he was a man who fought for Ukrainian independence, though actually didn't achieve it, but in the course of that he committed many massacres, he and his troops. Finally, which currency is this? The Russian ruble. And the Russian ruble, anybody know what the building is. The which? No, come on. The Bolshoi Theatre. Bolshoi Theatre, which is near the Kremlin, underneath, sort of below the Kremlin. And there's also the other bit I should know, but I don't know. That may be in the Kremlin, actually. It's a chariot with somebody on it. A chariot, yeah, with horses. Could be, but unfortunately it doesn't say. Actually, there's one guy in it. And behind is, I think, the Kremlin. It's probably a statue in the Kremlin. Anyway, it's about Russian history, and the Bolshoi Theatre is at the core of Russian culture. It's where ballet, which the Russians have always been very good at, indeed in some ways invented in its modern form, and opera, which Russians are also pretty good at, as indeed is Ukraine, with lots and lots of famous singers coming from there, and in the case of Russia, especially with Tchaikovsky, some of the most famous operas in the world. So what the notes are saying, what the ruble is saying, is that is giving a sense of Russian history, Russian culture. In other words, it's rooting it in a certain view of Russia, which it wants its citizens to be aware of and to be proud of. And the same is true in most currencies, though not in the case of the euro. So you see that currencies operate not just as a store of value, but actually in a way as a means of propaganda. Given that propaganda is trying to convince you of a certain point of view, what the currencies do is try to convince you of a certain point of view about a nation, that a nation has got a history, excuse me, a history, and that history is an honorable one, can be often a one in which victories were won and in which the country became greater or has remained great. So currencies do two things. One, they are an exchange value, a handy exchange value, but also in their form, in their very form, the way in which they are printed, the pictures on them tell you something or try to tell you something about your country. And that expresses, therefore, one of the core things about currencies, about money. You have to have trust in it. Currencies, especially paper currencies. What's a piece of paper? It's not worth anything. So you can take a £1,000 note, if there is such a thing as a £1,000 note, or a £100 note, and burn it. And what you're doing, you're burning a bit of paper. But actually, you're burning £100, quite a large store of value. So, but you have to have the trust that £100 is a store of value, which means you have to have trust back in the government. In the government and in the bank which issues that. Okay. So in the last century, 20th century, paper money became the way in which most currencies were exchanged, and people grew more or less to trust paper currencies, though at certain times, like in Weimar, which I mentioned, and other times too, they ceased to trust it. And even now too, in countries which are unstable, countries which have got weak governments, countries which are often at war, then money is also regarded as being untrustworthy. And very often, in some cases, very few cases, independent countries will use the currency of another country. Usually very small countries will use the currency of the country next door. There's a very small country called San Marino in Italy, tiny country, 30,000 people in it, really just a town, but it is formally an independent country, surrounded by Italy, and it did use the old Italian currency, the lira. It now uses the euro. More often, countries will use a currency, a stable currency, or a currency they believe and hope will be stable, as a peg, as something to which they link their own currencies. So when that currency goes up, their currency goes up, and when it goes down, and so on. And that has happened quite often. And happened, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed. After that, in the early 90s, some countries, anybody think of countries which did this, which linked their currency to other currencies of the former Soviet states? No? The Baltic states did. Estonia, I think, was the first to do so. I think it ceased to do so. Maybe others did as well. I'm afraid I've forgotten. But they linked their currencies, their currency, to the Deutschmark, I think, in that case. Belgium linked its currency to the French franc. The UK at one time linked, more or less, not explicitly, but what they call shadowed the Deutschmark in the early 90s in order to try to get stability for the currency. Shadowed means that you don't link it formally. You don't make an announcement that you have linked it to another currency. But it means that you are following that currency. The way in which that currency moves, your currency moves. And that was done, it's a long story, but that was done during the Thatcher government. Okay, so in the case of the EU, you have, as I said, the beginning of the EU in the Treaty of Rome from 1957. The key relationship in the EU has been, and to a degree still is, between Germany and France. Peace is at the core of it, the idea to make war impossible. And the founders had this idea in their minds that Europe would become one state, that the European Union would make a new country. And the people who thought that were called federalists, rather like the early American, the people who founded the American Constitution, founded the United States. They thought of Europe as a country in the making, something that would become a country over time, a state, a federal state with, of course, many different countries in it, but these would become rather like the states of the United States or the Länder, the different parts of Germany. They would become regions more than states. And you would have the supreme government would be in Europe. They thought of Europe as a new state. They recognized it would be a step-by-step process. It would take a long time. Some thought decades, others thought centuries. But from an early stage, they and their successors, the people who founded Europe, the first people who thought of Europe as a union of nations and therefore as a new state, people like Schumann, who was kind of Franco-German, Monet, who was French, Spinelli, who was Italian, and others. The people who came after them, who were the politicians like Adenauer in Germany, De Gasperi in Italy, they worked to create what became the European Union, and they had in their minds that over time, the government of which they were the leader would cease to be as important as the government they were working for in Europe. So it was and is a most remarkable thing that you have politicians, national politicians, who are working towards abolishing their power, or at least very substantially reducing their power, in order to create a new power being Europe, the European Union. So that didn't attract all Europeans. It didn't attract my country, which thought it was too important to be part of Europe at first, and has since thought that at least the euro was a rather bad idea. It didn't attract countries which could not be attracted, like the Eastern and Central European countries, which were part of the Soviet bloc. It didn't attract Spain and Portugal, which were then dictatorships until the 70s, and so on. But the core members decided it was a necessary step to go towards a common currency. By that time, many others had joined. Spain and Portugal had joined. The East and Central European countries were beginning to come into Europe, so it became much bigger. It was seen as a huge success in the 80s and 90s as it grew and expanded and took in the East European countries, the Central European countries like Czechoslovakia, as it then was now, Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, now bit by bit the former states of Yugoslavia. As they came in to Europe, Europe was seen as an enormous success, as a place where countries were attracted to it because of its success. So in midnight, in December 31st, 1999, for the countries which were part of the Euro bloc, which had decided to be part of it, their currencies ceased to exist separately, and they transferred to the Euro, which meant that everything was paid for no longer in Deutschmarks, in francs, in lire, in guilders and other currencies. They all used the Euro. So that currency, which began in the year 2000, is now 13 years old, was seen initially as a huge success. The transfer from the currencies from all the different currencies to the new one went very smoothly. 13 years on, it's now in danger. People are saying it may fail altogether. That Greece may have to come out of the euro, other countries may, and although the crisis is much less intense, apparently, it hasn't gone away and may indeed come back again. Anybody would like to suggest why there is such a problem in the Eurosphere? Is it Maria, yes? Partly, yeah. Greece is one of the biggest problems, yeah. Of leaving it, yeah. Right. Right. What would be the advantage of a country leaving the euro? I mean, there are lots of disadvantages, but why would a country want to leave the euro, do you think?
It could print more money to pay for their debts.
Yeah. Would be a value, because that would then inflate away the debt, so that you would be paying your debts back in a currency which had lost lots of its value, so that, yeah. No. They can go back, as the UK can. The UK does now, and others as well. Some of the Scandinavian countries and other countries which have not joined the euro can determine their own monetary policy. But what is regarded as being the most important thing, the thing that would immediately benefit countries which they used to be able to do but no longer can? Yes, they can. So a country exports, most countries export things, and these exports are priced at a certain level. If they devalue their currency, then these exports get cheaper. Of course, the imports get dearer, but the exports get cheaper, and therefore the economy then tends to benefit. So if Italy devalues its exports, like exports a lot of machinery, cars, rather less now because Fiat, which is its biggest car manufacturer, makes most of its cars abroad. Food, of course, it's very famous for its food, for its fashion. All of these things would be cheaper. And so its position as an exporter would improve enormously. At least that's the idea. So, but it can no longer do that. It cannot. It can't set its own interest rates. And therefore its ability to improve its economy in ways in which it used to improve its economy has gone. Because the euro is its currency. and that currency is no longer under its control. So that's the largest problem, or one of the large problems which these countries have faced, and why, for some at least, for some economists, not many, but some, have been arguing that these countries had best come out of the euro and go back to a system where they could control their own currencies, go back to the lira or the peseta or the franc even, and be like Britain, where Britain has flexibility and the ability to change its interest rates, to devalue, to do things which will at least immediately make its economy stronger. All of these things are now in debate within Europe, but one of the big issues which is a mixture of the economy and of politics is that when you have economies like, or countries like Greece, which need a lot of aid, but also Spain and Portugal and Italy and Ireland, and possibly also other countries which are quite strong countries at the moment, like France, where France has got now many more problems than it used to have or used to seem to have. How do you help these countries? What happens in national states when regions of national states need help? Yes, the central government puts money into regions which are poor. And they take that, of course, from regions which are rich. So the rich regions often resent that. In the UK, you have the richest part of the UK, by quite a long way, is the southeast. Southeast of England. Southeast of England, of course, is where London is, and London is an enormous generator of wealth, generates an awful lot more wealth than it spends. And the taxes from London will often go to poorer parts of the UK. One of the poorest parts used to be the part I came from, Scotland. It no longer is. It's now the third richest part of the UK, but it does go to the northeast of England. It goes to Northern Ireland, it goes to parts of Wales, areas where, as in Ukraine, the manufacturing sector is in trouble, and there's been decline in the incomes of these areas and a rise in unemployment. So I cannot tell you that. I can try and find out and tell you later, but it would be many billions. In the case of say, Northern Ireland, okay, you know that in the UK, the north of Ireland, which is about 1.5 million people, is not part of the Republic of Ireland. Because of the civil war in Ireland and the division between them, Northern Ireland remained British and has remained British ever since. But there has been a lot of fighting in Northern Ireland. I began in journalism in Northern Ireland, and what I was doing essentially was covering a low-level civil war, because it was quite difficult there in the 70s. And the economy of Northern Ireland declined quite rapidly, in part because it was dependent very heavily on heavy engineering. So a lot of money, billions and billions of pounds, have gone and still do go from the centre to Northern Ireland in order to assist it, both to keep up the level of welfare spending that it's the case throughout the UK, and to assist its unemployed and its industries to grow again. Well, you touch upon what I was coming to. No, it's what indeed is the attitude? Well, so Londoners say, we make a lot of money, we're successful, why should these Irish get it all? Or the Northern English? And people grumble that the unemployed don't really want to find work, and they have big families who are a burden on the state, and so on. And that's true in almost every country. In rich regions, and probably it's true in Ukraine, in the richer regions resent sending money to the less rich regions, but they do. They do because there's a sense, or their people have worked towards creating a sense that this is a country. It's Great Britain, it's Ukraine, it's Italy, where the Italian government in Rome sends a lot of money to the south, which is by far the poorest, and people in the north are very upset by that. Indeed, a political party was created called the Lega Nord, which objected to that. Nevertheless, it goes on. Because you have a country in which people have been taught to feel that they're in it together. This is our country, and therefore if people in one part of the country are upset by what happens by the way in which the money is sent to other parts of the country, well, too bad. The country has to stick together. We can't allow people in the south, or wherever it might be, in the north, in the UK's case, to be much poorer than we are. They've got to have the same level of pensions, of sickness benefits, of hospitals, of education, because that's the kind of country we are. The problem in Europe has been, and again it's a mixture, this mixture between politics and economics. The problem in Europe has been that the richer countries, again particularly Germany, have not felt the same way about the Greeks or the Italians or the Portuguese. And quite a lot of journalism in Germany, led by a tabloid. Do you know anybody know what the main tabloid paper is in Germany? Bild. Bild Zeitung has led the attack on the lazy Greeks who spend all their time on the beach drinking Retsina and not working and taking all our money. Bild has a circulation of 3.5 million, and that message has become very strong and remains very strong. And Chancellor Merkel, certainly before the election, and probably now, once she forms a government, has been very reluctant indeed to go beyond a certain measure, go beyond a certain position. She has, the European Union has, and she has been the crucial person in this, given a lot to Greece. Billions and billions, hundreds of billions of euros have gone into Greece, but the economy remains deeply in recession. Europe has demanded austerity measures, you remember them, and that has not helped the economy. Many economists believe that austerity makes things worse, and influential economists, economic commentators like my colleague on the FT, Martin Wolf, but even more, Paul Krugman of the New York Times, have argued strongly that austerity is a very bad thing for economies, and economies which try to come out of recession by cutting services and therefore trying to cut their debt are actually making matters worse, and at the very least the recession will last longer than it should have done, or indeed will last for the foreseeable future. So there's a big debate about what should be the right policy for Europe on this. So far, austerity has won. One of the things which you, as economic journalists and financial journalists, will need to be aware of and come to terms with, and which perhaps you already have, but you will tell me, I hope, is that in economics, as in politics and in many spheres of life, there are many, many different views. And people, economists are usually not backward about pushing their views forward, especially distinguished economists in universities and commentators in newspapers and elsewhere, and they will argue strongly for a particular point of view. And you as journalists, as reporters, assuming that you're not commentators, though some of you may indeed be commentators, will have to try to understand what the different points of view are. It doesn't mean to say you have to agree with one or the other, but you have to understand what people are arguing for. So in Ukraine, are there different points of view? Are there strongly different points of view by commentators? Economic commentators? Are some of you responsible for comments on the economy? Just as a matter of advice, which may well not you may well not need, but just to give it to you anyway. As I said earlier, and I think it's one of the most important things that in this discussion and in this these weeks that the FEG has put on for you, that the better journalists you will be, you will be the better journalists the more you understand. That's a very obvious thing to say, but it's a thing which is very important. And journalism is reckoned to be one of the key things in a free society. It's key because it teaches people daily, hourly now, what's going on in the society, what's going on in the economy, what's going on in politics. And it does, you know, this phrase, this English language phrase, it holds people and institutions to account. That is, it writes about, broadcasts about what people in power are doing, people in politics, people in companies, people who have power over citizens in various ways. And journalism, what it should be doing, is telling the citizens of the country what's happening in the country, and above all, what the people in power in the country are doing. So free journalism, journalism which can operate freely without fearing censorship or worse, going to prison, being stopped from writing in some forms, is very, very, very important for the future of a free society. As important in its way as elections and free politics. But journalism is only as good as the journalists, and freedom isn't enough. Freedom to write and to broadcast isn't enough. You must also understand what you're doing. And the problem in many countries has been and still is in some, that journalists have not had the time or the training to understand what they're writing and broadcasting about. So, again, I'm sure you don't have to be told this, but just to emphasize, and it's true everywhere, it's true in my country, it's true in the West generally, it's true everywhere. It's a profession in which you just have to keep on learning. Actually, many professions are like that. Doctors have to keep on learning the latest techniques in medicine. Accountants have to keep on learning the latest legislation, and financial and other legislation. People who are plumbers have to learn the latest techniques in plumbing. Everybody has to keep on learning. But we, perhaps at least as much as anybody else, have to keep on learning all the time. Learning what's new, learning how to do things in a new way, learning how to explain things in a different way. And so, for us, sources, people who can explain things to us, especially in business and financial journalism, are terribly, terribly important. And so it's very important indeed to get these people whom you trust, whom experience and other people's experiences are telling you know things and can explain them well and explain them truthfully, so that you will understand. And that's difficult. It takes time, it takes a lot of time. But it's the only way in which journalism can succeed. And the great journalism, the great financial and economic journalism, in many newspapers and magazines and broadcasting, although it's quite often more difficult in broadcasting because you've got such short time and you have to make things vivid and exciting. Great business and financial journalism nearly always comes from people who have done a great deal of work, both to understand what they're doing and to understand what's happening. The example I gave from Brussels of the Brussels press corps realizing from 2008 onwards that they simply didn't have the tools to understand what was happening in front of them. The depth of the crisis, the complexity of the crisis that was facing the euro currency, and therefore, for many of them, the need to educate themselves again, to read, to talk to sources, to get a comprehension of the mechanisms which were put in place, to question very closely the officials and the politicians who were doing it, is an indication, an index of how much a journalist has to do in order to be a really good journalist, and therefore to fulfill the task which we have, and which at its best, it's often not at its best, but at its best is a necessary part of a democratic society. And you, most of you quite young, are now at a crucial role, I think, both in your careers, in your life, and in the life of your country, because Ukraine has been an independent state now for more than 20 years. It faces, and we'll talk about this in the next session, it faces a really important decision, as you were saying earlier on, the decision which is now much talked about between being part of the Russian customs zone or signing an agreement with the EU, which is terribly important, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia and the EU, but for the world, because Ukraine is perhaps almost more than any other country, is between two enormous blocks of power. The one which had been ruled by Russia for many years, and the one which is the European Union. You are more than any other state between two worlds, and you've got to choose. Well, people are asking you to choose. I think actually you're going to have to keep going this way and that way for a long time, but there's a choice coming up, and it's a very important choice. It's expressed in economic terms, but it's also political. And so for you to explain that to your audience, to make your audience understand that this is a very important choice, is very important. And it's very important that you put out information, objective information. That is information which is true as far as you can tell it, and information which is solidly based on facts and on experience. So you're at a terribly important point, at least as important, in fact, probably in some ways more important than that which faces the journalists who are trying to describe what's happening in the European Union. Because this is the future of your country, and your country will be very much affected for decades, even centuries ahead, by this choice. At least that's what politicians are saying. Not always reliable, but in this case I think you can probably agree, we might agree with them, that it is an enormously important choice. To finish up with what I was talking about earlier about the European Union, and to draw this part of the program to a close. Europe and the euro, the currency, the euro, is faced still with, as I say, with this enormous crisis. And the man that I mentioned earlier, who is one of the best commentators on Europe, David Marsh, in his recent book, said that a number of things have to happen within the European Union in order to safeguard, to save, in the long term, the euro as a currency. And these include, he gave a 10-point plan, and these include making a full political union, having central control of all the budgets, all of the central banks, the different national central banks, should become essentially branches of the European Central Bank. there should be taxation powers at the center, full centralized taxation powers, the power in the Brussels Parliament or the Brussels government to tax everybody who is within the European Union or within the Euro. And burden sharing, what we talked about earlier, that is for the poorer parts of the European, of Euroland as it's called, like Greece, like Portugal, like Spain, or the parts which are in trouble, all of these are, then you share the burden, which means that the states, the richer states, the more successful states, would stimulate their economy and increase demand, which Germany has been reluctant to do, so they will draw in exports from these countries and make these countries better off. And to provide large-scale assistance to countries which get into trouble, so emergency assistance, which would be huge, billions, hundreds of billions, like to Greece, and finally a full-scale banking union. Now, that list, which is not all of the 10 points, but most of them and the most important ones, is, as David Marsh says, and I agree with him, impossible. A full political union in Europe is not going to happen soon. It may never happen, but it certainly isn't going to happen soon. In some ways, Europe, I think, has reached the limit, and this is an attempt to answer Irina's earlier point. What do I think about it? What I think is, it's impossible. It's impossible to address the crisis in the euro with the kind of program that David says is utterly essential. You need, he argues, and many politicians, many economists and others agree with him, including politicians, in order to control a currency, the euro, you need political mechanisms to do so. You need a fiscal union. You need a government which can decide for the whole area on matters like taxation, like social spending. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It collapsed. Well, you're a pessimist, clearly. And maybe the euro will collapse. In a way, this is what Marsh is arguing, that it will collapse. It does sound a bit like the Soviet Union. And the comparison, you're not the first to make that comparison. The Soviet Union, as you say, collapsed in part, in very large part, because economically it ceased to be viable. It just overstretched itself, partly because it was competing with the United States in an arms race which it couldn't afford, and in the end collapsed. So that's my view. My last question to you is, what do you think? Do you think the euro can survive? Yeah. Not Europe. Europe will survive in some form, but the euro. Too big to fail. That's what many people say. I'll tell them that. They'll make sure that Europe that it's still around for Ukraine to join. It'll be a while, but anyway. Yeah, well, actually, we can discuss that later, but that's true. I think the dollar will survive, but whether or not the rest of the world will. Anybody else? Elena. They will, yeah. I think that's probably right, and I think that David is right that that program, which is essential in the long term, will not be brought in soon and perhaps never. But I think that the whole number of stopgap measures, smaller, less radical measures, will be taken. It will be saved. There will be a constant crisis. Hopefully, the world economy will turn up, and Europe will continue, and the euro itself may well continue. Certainly, as a number of you have said, the political will, especially by Germany and France, to have it continue is very strong and has so far prevailed. But whether or not the governing mechanisms, the political mechanisms to do so will survive, will be put in place, is another and quite difficult matter to judge. So thank you for the first session. We're at our limit, quarter of an hour of break, and then we're back again at 11.